Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to episode 50 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, I'm going to give you a walkthrough of the EFM1 synthesizer in Logic, which is a FM synthesizer. Before we get into how this synth works, I would like to give you a basic overview of how FM synthesis works. And I really don't want this to turn into too much of a drawn-out lecture, but unless you understand the basic concepts of FM synthesis, you're not really going to understand what you're doing with the EFM1. And also keep in mind that the EFM1 is one of the simplest FM synths out there in the software world. There are other ones like the FM8 from Native Instruments, which are much more complex than the EFM1. But this synth is a great way to start and to kind of start learning about how FM synthesis works, and you can create some really nice sounds with it. So first, let's talk about how FM synthesis works and what it is. FM stands for frequency modulation synthesis, and this means that you can modulate the tone or the timbre of an oscillator by routing the signal of another oscillator into it. So imagine this like an electrical signal where you have a voltage-controlled oscillator with the signal of that oscillator being routed into another oscillator. When you route a voltage into a voltage, you're going to disturb and change the voltage of the second oscillator, and so you can create a more complex sound with your second oscillator. Oscillators in FM synthesis are referred to as operators, and there's basically two types of operators. You have carrier waves and modulator waves. The carrier is the actual oscillator that we hear, and then the modulator is the oscillator or the operator that is routed into the carrier. So the modulator modulates the signal of the carrier. So the modulator is disturbing the electrical signal of the carrier. Of course, in the EFM1, it's all digital, so it's just more or less just a reproduction of the way an analog FM synth would work. As far as the way that the modulator disturbs the carrier signal, there are many different ways that this can be done, and it depends on how loud the modulator is, what the frequency of the modulator is. But this picture just shows how a modulator can distort and change the signal of your carrier wave. So depending on again the volume and also the frequency of the modulator wave and also the frequency of the carrier wave, you'll get a different looking and different sounding sound on the output. So I think this diagram is a little more easy to understand because it shows how the modulator's signal is routed into the carrier. The modulator changes and distorts and disrupts the signal of the carrier, and so what happens is we get a new, more complex sound at the output of the synthesizer. So again, the carrier is the actual operator that we hear. It's sent to the audio output. The modulator just modulates the carrier wave, so we don't actually hear. We don't necessarily hear the modulator by itself, but we hear the effect that it has on the carrier. In older FM synths, like the Yamaha DX7, which was first introduced in 1983, the carrier and modulator were both sine waves. In newer FM synths, you can often change and customize what waveform you want the carrier wave and the modulator wave to be. In the EFM1, like I said, it's a bit simpler than some of the other FM synths out in the market. The carrier wave is always a sine wave, and the modulator can be customized to basically be any waveform you want it to be. By the way, the Yamaha DX7 didn't just have two operators. In the EFM1, we're stuck with one carrier, one modulator. The DX7 actually had 6 operators, but they were all sine waves. So if you're able to customize a waveform to be anything you want it to be, even in the EFM1 where we can just change what the modulator is, it gives you a whole plethora of other tones that you can work with. When you're stuck with only 6 sine waves, it seems like a lot because you're getting 6 operators, but the signal that you're getting at each operator is so simple that it takes a lot more modulation, and it requires more operators to get, say, the same sort of sound that you can get from the EFM1. Another factor in FM synths is the frequency ratio between the carrier and the modulator. Like I said before, the type of sound you get at the output from the carrier depends on how high or low the frequency the modulator and the carrier are. And some basic frequency ratios are 1-1, which means that both of the operators have the same frequency, the same pitch. 2-1 means that one of them, or 1-2 means that one of them is 1 octave higher. 4-3 means that you have a perfect fourth. So in essence, one oscillator is 133.33% higher than the other, and a 3-2 ratio is a perfect fifth, which means that one operator is 150% higher than the other. These are really common, very stable, musically stable frequency ratios. What we'll find later when we start working with the EFM1 is that the more complex the ratio is, something like a 6-7 or a 9-8, those ratios are going to result in less musically useful but sometimes more clangy bell-like sounds. So they can still be used, but these 4 ratios tend to be the most stable. But there's a whole plethora of other frequency ratios out there. And then another factor with FM synths is the FM algorithm. With the EFM1, we only have 2 operators, 1 modulator, 1 carrier. So there's only one way that the 2 operators can be chained together. In other FM synths, there's often different ways you can chain your modulators and your carriers together. And oftentimes you can tell certain operators to be carriers and others to be modulators. So you can have like 2 carriers and 2 modulators, or maybe 3 carriers and 1 modulator, or 3 modulators and 1 carrier. So this diagram is taken from the Yamaha TX81Z, which is from 1986, and you can see it has 8 algorithms, and depending on which algorithm you choose, you can choose which operator is going to be a carrier and which of them is going to be a modulator. So for instance, in number 1, operator 1 would be the carrier. Operator 2, 3, and 4 would all be modulators. If you look at number 6, operators 1, 2, and 3 are carriers, and operator 4 is a modulator. Another thing that you can add that's pretty common in FM synths is feedback, and that's what's going on the 4th operator in each of these algorithms. The signal of the 4th operator is actually being fed back into itself, and that usually at low amounts can add a nice sort of like resonance to the signal, much like adding resonance in a filter would. It kind of boosts the high end and gives it a little bit more of a kind of a ringy sound. All right, so that's just the basics of FM synthesis. We're now going to move on to how to use the EFM1. But if you're really interested in understanding FM synthesis more than what I've given you here in just an 8-minute portion of a video, I would highly recommend you check out Simon Can's Synthesizer Bootcamp. He's got a few videos in his Synthesizer Bootcamp series that pretty thoroughly explain how FM synthesis works, and also he shows musical examples as well. So that's Simon Can's Synthesizer Bootcamp, and I'll make sure I put a link to that in the video. All right, so from this point on, we're going to start working with the EFM1, so I'll be right back. All right, we're back, and let's work with the EFM1 now. Like I said before, as long as you understand the basic concepts of FM synthesis that I introduced in the beginning of this video, you'll have no problem kind of understanding how the EFM1 works. So to start, this is just what the stock setting sounds like. It's really basic sound. What I'm going to do to start is actually reset everything so that I just get a sine wave. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to turn off this fixed button here. I'm going to set both the harmonic of the modulator and the harmonic of the carrier to 1. I'm going to option click on both of the fine knobs to set them to default. I'm going to option click on this FM depth knob to set that to default. I'm going to option click on the transposition to set that to default. And I'm going to do the same with the main level, with the velocity, stereo detune, and sub oscillator level. Not all of those. I mean, depending on what setting you're using, you may not have to turn all of those off. I'm just being safe. And also on the LFO, where it says vibrato FM, you can option click on that as well. And then for the FM knob, I'm also going to option click on that. And so what we should get now is just a sine wave. There we go. So the way this synth works is exactly like I explained in kind of the presentation at the beginning of this video. We have two oscillators, two operators, one that's called the modulator, one that's the carrier. So the idea is that the signal of the modulator is being fed into the signal of the carrier, and depending on the tuning of the modulator and the volume of the modulator, it can affect the signal of the carrier. Right now, both the carrier and the modulator are both sine waves. And so what I'm going to do, just so you can kind of visually see what's going on here, is I'm going to open up a EQ. So I'm going to open up an EQ and turn on the analysis, just so you can kind of see that this is indeed a sine wave. So I'll just play middle C. And you can see we're just getting a sine wave at about 261.63 hertz, which is middle C. What we can do is we can make the signal of the modulator go into the signal of the carrier and create FM synthesis by pulling up this big FM knob in the middle here. Essentially what this does is it adjusts the depth of the FM synthesis. So it's essentially affecting how much, it's controlling how much of the signal of the modulator is being fed into the carrier. So all the way down, we're just hearing the carrier wave. We're not hearing the modulator wave at all. So if I play a note and then slowly turn up the FM knob, you'll see this. So the higher the FM knob, the higher the FM depth, the louder the modulator is, the more signal from the modulator is going into the carrier, and the more complex our signal gets down in our frequency analysis here. What's happening is with FM synthesis, the whole idea is that you're able to create artificial kind of extra overtones from the FM synthesis. And these extra overtones are called sidebands. So we just start with, again, a sine wave. And as we pull up the FM depth, we get these extra sidebands. So I'm going to pull that about a third of the way up. One of the other things that we can do is we can adjust the tuning of the two operators. Like I've said in the presentation at the beginning of this video, you can adjust the frequency ratio between the two operators. The way the tuning system works for these operators is in harmonics. So right now, with the carrier set to 1, it's basically on the fundamental frequency of the harmonic series. If you put this up to 2, it's up an octave. If you put it up to 3, it's up an octave and a fifth. You put this up to 4, it's up an octave, a fifth, and a fourth, and so forth and so on, all the way up the harmonic series. For this video, just to keep it simple, because the harmonic series gets quite complex past an octave, a fourth, and a fifth and a fourth, rather. I'm just going to stick with basically 1, 2, and 3, the first, second, and third harmonics. So right now, with both of these set to 1, we have a 1-to-1 frequency ratio, which means that both the modulator and the carrier are at the same frequency. So we get a very musically stable sound. If we pull the modulator up to 2, the modulator is now 1 octave higher than the carrier. So we get a little bit more complex signal, and if I pull up the FM depth, we'll hear that even more. It gets a little more wooden quality to it. If we do a 3-to-2, we have a 3-to-2 ratio. That means that the modulator is a perfect fifth higher than the carrier. So we get something like this. And then the last frequency ratio that I introduced in the presentation was 4-to-3, which is a perfect fourth. Now you're free to experiment with any frequency ratio you like, but the more complex the frequency ratio is, the more bell-like and the less musically useful it's going to be. So you can see a 7-to-6 ratio is a very bell-like sounding, and if you pull it up a little further, there's a whole plethora of different sounds we can find in there. So I'm going to go back to, and I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to go back to a 3-to-2. perfect fifth. There we go. Another factor that we can control is the modulator's waveform. As I said in the presentation, the carrier wave is always a sine wave. The modulator, we can modulate between different waveforms. The way this wave knob works is all the way to the left, it's a sine wave. As you turn it up, you get more of like a triangle wave sort of sound, and then it kind of morphs into a sawtooth and then into a square wave. And so you can kind of pull this up and pick the point where it sounds good to you. So I'll stick with that. There we go. There we go. Other things that we can control, there's some global controls at the top. You can adjust the tuning in cents. You can adjust the entire tuning of the entire synthesizer in semitones. You can bump the whole thing up an octave, down an octave. So if this is more like a bass type instrument, you could try bumping the whole thing down an octave. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep it at its root tuning. You can adjust the voice count. If you are indeed using it as a polyphonic synth, you have up to 16 voices that you can use. And if you click on this, you can also load it in legato or mono mode, just like we did in the ES2. So if I go ahead and load this in legato, I can only play one note at a time. And if you pulled the glide up, it creates a glide between notes, just like it did in the ES2. There we go. I'm not going to utilize the glide, and I'm going to put this back on 16 voices. Also, like the ES2, we have a unison option. The unison option in the EFM1 is a bit more simple than it was in the ES2 because all it basically does is it doubles up the number of voices on every key. So instead of one voice on every key, you get two voices on every key, and you get a bit of just a little bit richer chorus effect. So that's what the unison on. I'm going to leave that on. Next section I want to show you are the volume controls. There's a volume envelope. It's just a dedicated volume envelope. And there's a main volume level. So my synth is a bit loud. I'm going to pull the volume down just a bit so it's not so loud. There we go. And the volume envelope is a lot like the third envelope was in the ES2 video. It has 4 stages: attack, decay, sustain, and release. And so if we want this to be more of like a pad or a synth pad or ambient sound, we can pull the attack up a bit and pull the release up a bit. It'll take longer for the sound to fade in, longer for it to fade out. If I pull the attack and release time down, it's going to be more of like a lead or a bass type instrument where the sound immediately comes in and immediately dies out when you let go of the key. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the attack and release up a bit. So I like that. There's also a velocity sensitivity here. With this all the way to the left, velocity will have no effect on the volume of the overall sound. If you pull it to the right, velocity will have an effect on the sound. So all the way to the left, it doesn't matter how soft or hard you hit the keys, you'll get the same volume. If you pull this up, there will be a difference. So soft, hard. So you can get some variation in volume. I'm going to pull this down, but not all the way down. There's also a sub-oscillator you can add to the signal. And basically what the sub-oscillator does is it adds a low sine wave below the lowest note you play to kind of reinforce the bass. So here's without it. If I put, actually I'll play a different note. There we go. And if I pull it in, you can see that extra tone there in the frequency analysis. So again, without it, and then with it. So it's basically just like another oscillator that we can add in to reinforce the bass. And there's also a stereo detune control, which detunes the left and right channel to create a bit of a chorus effect. But if you turn it up too much, it can just kind of sound like it's out of tune. So if I pull it down just a bit, you can still hear sort of kind of a beating chorus effect in there. But if you pull it up too much, the left and right channel are too far out of tune. They just sound like dissonance. I'll just pull it up just a bit. Next up is the LFO. Unlike the ES2 and unlike many other synthesizers out there, the LFO in the EFM1 only has two targets that it can go to, either vibrato or FM. And the rate cannot be synced, and the rate actually doesn't even tell you what you're syncing it to. You just kind of have to, or what the rate is, you just kind of have to ear it, basically, just play it by ear. On the vibrato side, it affects the pitch of the modulator and the carrier. So the actual LFO knob itself controls the depth of the effect, and the rate controls the speed. I don't really find that entirely useful for the synth, but the other one, the FM depth, controls the big FM knob. So imagine an LFO being able to sweep this FM knob back and forth. That's essentially what this does. So it's kind of like a filter sweep, but an FM sweep instead of a filter sweep. Again, the only downside is that it can't be synced to the beat clock, so you can't tell it to be a specific musical value. I'm going to turn that off. And the last thing I need, or the second to last thing I need to show you, is the modulation envelope. The modulation envelope basically can control the FM depth, just like the LFO can control the FM depth. So if you adjust this here, you're essentially playing with the motion of the big FM knob here. So if I pull this up and then pull the attack time up and pull the release time up, you'll hear essentially a one-time FM sweep as opposed to a repeating FM sweep, which we did with the LFO. So the sweep only happens once. Let me pull that down a bit. You can also do it inverted. Pull it to the left. And sometimes you have to pull the amount up a bit more for it to make sense. And then there's also just a modulator pitch control where you can make the envelope control the pitch of the modulator. I don't find this, like the vibrato, I don't find it really that musically useful. Maybe for special effects, but other than that, you can also do this in inverse as well. So I'm going to turn that off as well. Another way to control the FM depth is to come down to this little arrow here, and this opens up a menu with a few other options. The one I'm concerned about is the Control FM menu, and what you can do with this is you can assign a MIDI continuous controller to the FM knob. So you can either learn a control like we did in the ES2 just by hitting learn, then moving a fader up and down, or what you can do is you can choose one of the listed CCs. So if I want to use the modulation wheel, now my modulation wheel will control the FM depth. So modulation wheel down, modulation wheel up. going to pull the FM depth down a little bit. So now you have free control over that FM knob with your modulation wheel. One of my favorite ways to do it is to do it with the aftertouch setting. And again, you know, only some keyboards have aftertouch. Not all keyboards have aftertouch. It basically means that the harder I press down on the keys after I've already pressed the key, so the key pressure essentially will determine how much that FM depth goes up. So I can hold the key down and then press harder, and I'll get this sort of an effect. So every time you hear that filter or that FM open up, I'm pressing down harder on the key. So it's the EFM1 is really great for things like kind of glassy sounding pads, or kind of I hate to say wobble bass, but more or less the kind of dirty bass sounds, or kind of talking bass sounds. It all depends on, you know, where the FM depth is, where your modulator is. You can go in and kind of customize this until you find the sound you're looking for. And the amount of that modulation is going to be determined right here where it says control FM amount. So only 0.28 is just a subtle effect. If I pull this up, we're going to hear even more. So it's great for basses, sort of bell tones, glassy tones, things like that. Another thing that you can do, much like the ES2, is you can randomize the features of the EFM1. Once again, it's not something that's going to be that musically useful, but it's something that might be useful for sound effects, if you're looking for sound effects and you know, ambient sounds for film or something like that. Here, you don't even get to control what you randomize. Pretty much everything is randomized. You just pull up the randomize amount and then hit the button next to it, and it randomizes everything. Almost like a siren effect there. I'll hit it again. Like a sci-fi siren. So some of these are really cool for Foley. If you're looking for sound effects for film. I'll try one more. So there you go. So that's the EFM1 in a nutshell. It's a really simple synthesizer. As long as you understand the basics of FM synthesis, it's really easy to use. So that wraps up the video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.